Today, we discuss wide receiver tiers. What is quickly transforming in Superflex into possibly the most valuable position, right? These wide receivers that we're talking about, it used to be we wanted quarterbacks at the beginning of every Superflex draft. We're kind of reevaluating that. Wide receiver values rising a little bit in our mind, and very excited to go through our tiers with you today. Stick around for all that and more. And welcome into the Dono Construction Podcast. Justin, joined by David and JP. Excited to talk wide receivers today. How'd you guys feel about the conference championship games this weekend?
I would have preferred the opposite team win in both matchups. I'm sure we'll get a good Super Bowl, though, right? It's last game of the year, so hopefully it's at least a good game. Should be.
It was nice to at least see Saquon go crazy. I'll take solace in that. And yeah, I agree. I wanted the Commanders to win. I'm from Virginia. The darn Chiefs. I think everybody was rooting against them pretty much.
What can you do about it? Seems like the Chiefs are inevitable. But hopefully the Eagles can win. Fly, Eagles, fly. We're about to jump right into the tiers real quick, but if you have not hit that like and subscribe, easiest way to help the channel, means the world to us. So, of course, we are going to start out with tier number one. Tier number one has some incredible young wide receivers in it. The type of guys that I think are championship cornerstones for the foreseeable future for your teams. And who do we have in that tier, David?
I will qualify after I read the names. We've got Chase, Jefferson, CD, and Neighbors. We don't typically like to do this, but we did kind of do a tier 1A, 1B here. Chase and Jefferson are tier 1 no matter who you are, what situation you're in. We really like CD and Neighbors as well. CD's had a wide receiver 1 overall season very recently. Neighbors seems to be on that trajectory. So just kind of depending on where your team's at, probably CD's tier 1 for competitor, Neighbors probably tier 1 for maybe everyone, but at least certainly if you're rebuilding. Kind of hard to break up really the top 8 guys in general. That's how we have this group of 4, at least.
You have a clear-cut top 8 to spoil tier 2. How many guys are in there a little bit? CD Lamb, he was the least exciting of this group this season. He's wide receiver 9 in points per game at 17.6, but we know that he has the talent to be wide receiver 1 because he was just last year. I mean, obviously, he did not have Dak Prescott this season. Things were a little bit off the rails. See if they can get back on track. I think that's the only reason he's ahead of some guys in the tier 2 is because we've seen that wide receiver 1 season from him already. You guys kind of point out that he's not that far ahead of some of the tier 2 guys.
Yeah, to me, when we were having this discussion, I'm sure Chase and Jefferson are here. And then when we let anybody else in, I just felt like, okay, but if we let in Lamb, how do we not let in this guy, and this guy from tier 2? Don't want to spoil the names, even though you all already know who is in here. Just talking cash price on these guys, because I think that's fun to do with the wide receiver and quarterback position. Of course, we're not including any rookie picks in this tier because we'd have to include, instead of the 101 to the 103, we'd practically have to include, the 101, 102, and 107 or something like, I don't know. Yeah, it's not one pick. But what are we willing to pay for these guys? Let's just start with that line of 3 firsts. Even though these guys are, besides Neighbors, a year older than they were last offseason, we'd pay 3 firsts. Are we still paying 3 firsts, JP, in a vacuum?
Probably for all of them, except for maybe CD. The other 3, I definitely would. CD, it depends how I feel about those firsts. I'd have to think about it a little bit harder.
Yeah, I think 3 firsts is a fair price. Depending on league format, the deeper you go, the harder it is to pay that. And obviously how good those firsts are. Chase and Jefferson, at least one of those firsts is going to have to be a known good first, whether it's already, a high first this year or at least a bad team's 26, maybe 27 first. But it's just so hard to project out that far. But yeah, I think 3 firsts is fair. Maybe 2 strong firsts could get you CD or Neighbors.
Yeah, and along that bad team's firsts, a great process way to sell a bad team's first is selling a team their first back when they may or may not want to rebuild. I know it wasn't somebody in this tier, I believe it was Amon-Ra, but I saw JP, get a deal done like that where he's getting credit for a first being early simply because that other team controls the destiny of it, right? So definitely a way you can try to know it's that's a process deal that you can try to do, because if Chase or Jefferson is on that team's roster, they might be bad. It's hard to get the 101 when you have Chase on your roster, no matter how bad the rest of your roster is, because he could. You can still do it, but just kind of a process thought. And then cross-positionally, tier one quarterbacks, we haven't gone through them, but of course we know that in tier one we have Jaden Daniels, we have Josh Allen. I assume we're still going to end up with Lamar Jackson in tier one, but we won't know that till next week when we actually have our full conversations. What is the difference between these tier one wide receivers and how the wide receiver position is played off and the tier one quarterbacks for you guys is something I want to touch on.
That's hard because quarterbacks are so scarce in almost every format that it really depends on how my quarterback room looks. Typically, I would like to tier up from one of these guys into those quarterbacks if I need a quarterback. Really hard to imagine a situation where I'm tearing down from one of those tier one quarterbacks into a receiver. If you happen to have a team that strong, then good for you. But I think we're probably more reasonably talking at least a cross positional trade 1-for-1 into probably tier two of quarterbacks.
And when we are talking tier two quarterbacks, so not anybody outside of those three, because I think that's going to be our tier one for sure. Obviously, maybe like a Jalen Hurts and his rushing upside, it's stomachable to go to. But if we're going into just a tier two quarterback who's a passing quarterback who's going to have down seasons, a process question I'm asking myself is is it better to have one of these tier one wide receivers than a guy like Joe Burrow who just had an amazing year but has touchdown dependency as a quarterback, right? Doesn't have the rushing upside. Is it better to stick with these wide receivers than to go with a tier two quarterback and try to patch in somebody further down the line at quarterback, like a Goff, Mayfield type of guy, although Mayfield just had some amazing production.
Yeah, I mean, it's really tough to say. I think it's going to be dependent on format because if it's start 9 or 10, like the quarterbacks are a lot more valuable. But if you're in a start 11, the wide receivers do get a lot more valuable because, I mean, you could start up to 6 of them. And then thereas the quarterbacks begin to get a little bit less value since they're only 2 out of 11 positions, even though they still do score the most points. I do still think that a guy like Joe Burrow probably going to last a little bit longer, but it is a good question. I don't know if I have the perfect answer for that necessarily. But I think the rushing guys you obviously feel a lot better about. But guys like Burrow, those passing guys, they do kind of fluctuate from year to year. So I definitely understand where you're coming from there. And I could see siding with receiver potentially.
I kind of think a better way to get at the answer you're looking for is to talk startup. That trade really is so team dependent. But in a startup, if I'm in like the middle or end of the first, would I rather take Chase or Jefferson over these guys and be able to adjust the rest of the draft accordingly? If you asked me a year or two ago, I'd say no way, give me the quarterback these days. I think there's a very strong case for these receivers to go above a lot of those tier two quarterbacks in a startup.
I mean, and these wide receivers, we obviously love, and you actually see Chase, Jefferson, and CD. They were the wide receiver 1 in the last 3 seasons. It was Jefferson 2 years ago, CD last year, and Chase this year. And obviously, Malik Neighbors, he just broke the rookie record for most catches before Brock Bowers did a few hours later.
What David's saying there, that change in strategy, it's something we're noticing because I think we're just noticing consistently that whether it's Trevor Lawrence that was being taken ahead of some of these guys, if just one off season ago, not this past off season, but the one before it, CJ Stroud going before these guys this season. I think it's definitely a different question. These guys, incredible value. I think we've probably beaten this like a dead horse, and we'll talk more about this throughout the off season anyway. So if you like that type of strategy, a conversation, we're hoping to really dive into that type of meta startup strategy coming up.
Let's move on to tier 2. JP, can you read tier 2 for us real quick?
Yeah, we got 5 guys here. We got Amon-Ra St. Brown, Puka Nacua, Nico Collins, and Brian Thomas Jr. in here, as well as the 101 with maybe a plus.
For me, for Amon-Ra, for Nico, I'd say for Puka, and for BTJ, it is a plus with the 101 for me. So definitely agree with this plus. These are some stud wide receivers. Nico was the wide receiver 1 in points when he went out with his injury. Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver 3 in back-to-back seasons. Puka, some injury problems this year, but when he was on the field, absolute difference maker stud. And what BTJ did, honestly, if it wasn't for Neighbors and what Neighbors did, we might be discussing BTJ in tier 1 simply because he's young and he produced so crazily. Just Neighbors was just like, hold my beer. I'm going to do better. So these are some incredible, incredible players. Love to see them here. I just want to start price point on these guys. Are we willing to pay over 3 firsts? Let's start out with Amon-Ra St. Brown. David first, then JP.
If I have the assets in there mid or late, then maybe, but I would prefer to buy any of these guys for 2 firsts than the one specifically for more than that. So I mean, if I can do even 101 and my 26 first if I'm competing, that's a lot to pay. I might want to get something back just because Janty is probably top 24, at least 36 asset at this point. I'd have to look, but man, that's a good price to get these guys. They're not far from tier one, and any of them I think are capable of wide receiver one overall. So I don't know about three unless they're mid to late, like I said, but it's fair.
I was a little bit staying with CD Lamb, but I don't, I had to think about it, and I do value him higher. So I think I'm more at like 2 firsts and maybe a couple of seconds with these guys. I think that's more of what I'd be looking to offer up for some of these guys. And like you said, the 101 with Genti, he might be top 30 asset is what I would say. And I think these guys probably top 18 at this point for sure. That's where I would value them as a startup.
I would be shocked if by July the 101, we assume it's Janty. Maybe it'll be who knows what it'll be. I'm 85% confident, 90% confident it's Janty. Going to be a top 18 asset by July, August. It would be my best guess just from history of that 101 and what it does. I'm just trying to get like a value point here from you guys. So we're seeing a clear difference then in your price appetite between these guys and what you'd pay for the guys in tier one, who we all feel like are worth kind of 3 firsts in value. Again, these guys, David said 3 late firsts, but with the guys in tier one, if one of those firsts is early, we're feeling a little bit different. So that's kind of just trying to qualify that tier price. Do you kind of agree, David, that 3 late firsts is the most you'd pay for one of these guys, and for the tier one you're willing to pay an early and then a mid and a late potentially, depending?
Especially Chase and Jefferson, I'll pay that without thinking much. I think it kind of blends from there based on team needs, league settings, and stuff. So the cheapest one I can get really out of this tier, and I don't want to say cheapest out of Neighbors and CD because I value them above that, but if the price is too high on Neighbors or CD, I'd be happy to pivot to one of these guys for a lower price. Three is a lot. I don't know that I'd pay it for Nico. I don't know that I'd pay it for Amon-Ra because they're both a little bit older. But I mean, man, if I'm trying to win and I happen to just have 3 firsts, that's a huge boost to your lineup. So,
and then that caveat that you just said, when we're saying these cash prices, we're not saying go out and send your 25, your 26, and your 27 first for Puka or for Amon-Ra or even for Jefferson. When we're talking about that, we're talking about like the value, right, of this guy. But what he said, if I have it, you do not want to mortgage your future to get a single guy. And then if you have somebody else go down your roster, now your 26 first is the 103. So just what David's saying about if you have it, just want to really, as we're going through and talking about these prices, that we're not looking to always do that. It's just like a overarching theoretical price.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think something I like to bring up when I can, at least for me, depending on how active the league is, I think you get one of these deals every year or 2. Maybe you get 2 in a 3-year period where, like, if you're really active and you're good at building up assets, you can then go and consolidate them into a stud. So you definitely can't just keep doing it over and over again. But if you're sitting there asset rich and you're like, man, I just don't have a stud wide receiver, that's when you look to pay this kind of price. Or if someone's trying to sell below the price we're talking about, typically it's a good buy because someone eventually will pay that price.
Just kind of talking, since we are doing tiers, talking from a tiering up from one of these guys to Jefferson or Chase. If the price was the 112, I'm personally not interested in doing that. Probably would either of you guys consider adding the 112 to get to a Chase or Jefferson from any of these 4 guys?
I'm not sure that I do. I was thinking more like 2 seconds is kind of what I had in mind. What I would be paying? Because I mean, when it comes to a guy like Puka and Nico, I think that they could score pretty similar to Jefferson. Like, I mean, Puka's a little younger. He was just wide receiver 3 in points per game. So I think it's hard to pay a late first to move up to one of those guys, especially with him, because you're getting a little bit older in that case. Maybe Nico could be at the bottom of this because he's a little bit older. I think I'm looking at more like 2 seconds. Is that what you're thinking, David?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say 1-2 swap in my gut, but I will say if it's like start 9 or maybe even start 10 and I've got a really good roster, I don't think that's unreasonable to pay to get up there.
Yeah, I don't think it's unreasonable to like pay. It's just uncomfortable, and I don't think I want to.
When is getting Chase or Jefferson in trade not uncomfortable?
It's very, very difficult to get those guys in a trade that is not uncomfortable. I guess I just view these guys as hammer-esque, and I just never, the process I like to use is never trying to use a hammer to get a hammer. I think
That's
it's
fair.
a very big difference between next week when we're talking quarterbacks in tier 2 who aren't necessarily really hammers. They're just very good and have value. To these guys, I think we would expect all of these guys to be top 16 wide receivers and have some relative confidence that these should be wide receiver ones if they're healthy. All 8 of these guys actually being wide receiver ones, I would bet that won't happen. I'd bet somebody falls out because it's really hard to say these 8 guys are all going to be wide receiver ones. There's only 12 of them, and there's a lot of other talented wide receivers later on. But I think top 16, give or take, on a points per game basis when they're healthy, I think is a pretty safe in that difference-ish making range. I don't have a lot of interest. The only guy I feel like I'm interested in doing it is Brian Thomas Jr., but I feel like that's probably questionable because I think he probably has the most room to grow in value. So
He also has the most to lose, I think.
he has a lot to lose. You're right. That's why I'm scared.
I
Yeah,
get it.
I definitely understand that from a security standpoint. But yeah, Brian Thomas Jr., he's wide receiver 6 on Keep Trade Cut. He just turned 22 a few months ago. He's wide receiver 13 in points per game. And I think the offense was pretty bad. And I think the offense could get a lot better. He could get better as a player. So I could easily see him jumping into tier 1 next year. I love him, but I definitely understand why you're a little bit nervous. I feel a little bit more confident in him, though.
Yeah, I also want to say that's a good point about not using a hammer to get another hammer. I think that's typically smart. But I think situationally you can do it. But again, that's kind of like the one shot you get a year. Like, don't you want to get another hammer?
Yeah, I would just much rather try to add that 112 and another first to T. Higgins and see if I could get into the conversation of anybody in either of these 2 tiers. Although that's probably a little bit much to pay for some of the tier 2 guys. I think that's not an unreasonable price to pay for any tier 1 guys. And moving on to tier 3 here, we have, is this the Ohio State tier? No, I guess it's just
pretty
the first 2 guys. Marvin Harrison Jr., JSN, Drake London, AJ Brown, Garrett Wilson. I guess there's 3 OSU guys. Lad McConkey, Rashee Rice, and the pick range 102 to 10.
I'm sorry, David, but the tier 1 was the LSU guys. Just had to get that out there.
Yeah, they might have the quality right now, but we still have quantity. And give me till 27. We'll have Marv, hitting his stride, and the first pick in the draft is going to be a Buckeye receiver. So I get it. LSU's great. Not trying to take anything from them, but we got several guys on this list here now that they're out of the way.
And so with these guys right here, we've got a little bit of youth and upside. We have a large amount of production in this tier as well. Very interesting tier. We have that price point as the 102 to the 104. AJ Brown is the only old guy in this tier. Everybody else is young, has room to ascend upwards. So how are we handling this tier? Like, what is the process you're kind of doing with players like this on a contending team? Are we looking to use these guys as ammunition to go further up? What's your ideas?
It's very different from player to player, honestly. Because there's 2 guys in London and Rice I value a lot higher. Actually, I have them in a separate tier. But if it's somebody like JSN, Marv, Garrett Wilson, the Ohio State guys, maybe even Lad McConkey too, I probably do want to tier up because I feel a little bit more nervous about them. I don't know about their upside as much. I mean, Marv has the upside and Wilson does too. I love those guys, but the situation I don't necessarily love. And the guys in tier 2, you said, Justin, that's hard to that some of them probably will fall out of the top 12, maybe 1 or 2, but I feel so good in that tier that it's hard to see any of those guys falling out of the top 12, which you're right, on average, 1 probably will.
And when I say out of the top 12, I just mean 12 to 16. I'm not saying off the face of the world. Is not what I'm predicting.
Absolutely. And these guys here, I just feel a lot less confident in. When it comes to Drake London, he was a couple points per game behind the tier 2 guys, and he's only 23 years old. I think he could really grow with Penix. I really like him. And what we saw from Rashee Rice, I'm super encouraged by. He was wide receiver. It was only a 3-game sample, but he would have been wide receiver 2 in points per game. Has some concerns here as well. But the other guys, I probably am looking to tier up. I'm a little bit nervous about AJ Brown's trajectory with the offensive change with Saquon and how run heavy they are, and him also starting to get a little bit up there in age.
We make fun of me for my Ohio State homerism enough. We got to say something about JP putting London in a tier above all these guys, right?
Atlanta people. What can you do about these Atlanta fans, man? It's just, they're incorrigible.
If I'm contending, I'm happy to explore what it takes to get from any of these guys to Jefferson or Chase. I'll pay a little bit maybe to move up to the other guys in our first 2 tiers. I like the upside of everyone here. I know maybe it's my homerism with Marv, but he was an elite prospect. He was learning a difficult position. I know Kyler's still going to be his quarterback, so I can't really use his play as a chance for why Marv might get better next year. But I still believe in the player. Sometimes it just takes a year or two. These guys are still young. Jason just had a year two breakout. That was pretty massive. London obviously is looking great. He was really young when he came into the league, so he's still really young. AJB still beats man coverage better than probably anybody in the NFL. I love Garrett Wilson. I'm a little worried. I don't know where he's going to play. I don't know who's going to be his quarterback, even if he stays with the Jets. Some size concerns, and maybe they'll bring in more competition for Ladd. And then Rice, obviously, his injury and his legal situation. So there's question marks for everyone in here, but there's serious upside too. I'm not going to pay a ton to move up unless it's to Jefferson or Chase.
Not entirely different in idea there. When I talk about moving up from tier 2 to tier 1, David, the price you threw out was a 1-2 swap in a league where I had Marv, did not like Marv's production, and I could get up into tier 2. I did a 1-2 swap, ended up probably losing 8 or 9 slots. It ended up being the 111. I moved down to like the 207, something in that neck of the woods of a deal to get from Marv to Puka. That's the absolute most I would do, and it's very situational. At this point right now, when there's no points being scored and I won a championship. I don't care if I lost value. I won a championship. I wanted the points in the lineup. I knew Puka would score more. We're in the off season, so I don't really see very much of a point in doing that unless I was going from probably the only guy I would try to tier up from this tier to another tier to would be AJ Brown if I don't think I'm contending next year, or if my contendingness is questionable, because then I feel like I'm more locking up and securing AJ Brown's value, paying a little bit more, but I have the same amount of value coming back, give or take. And then I'm having a younger asset that's not going to depreciate as much as AJ Brown will before I'm contending. But I do agree with you, David, just as a whole, until points are being scored next year, I don't have much interest in tiering up from this tier because I think they're all assets that are going to retain value until we see what they do on the field.
The one thing I want to say about Ladd is if they don't bring in a big time wide receiver, I just don't think his value is going to increase all that much. But if they do, I think he does lose a decent amount of value in the market or what you could get for him. So personally, do you guys think that it's a good time to potentially move on from him? I mean, or do you think that his value could rise much more if they don't draft somebody or bring in a free agent?
Whenever you have a young guy who especially had a really nice end to the season, who has a pretty positive narrative out there right now about him, always worth exploring trying to sell high, right? Like he had 7 straight double digits and a couple in the 20s, a couple at 18 to finish the year. So really strong finish to the year, which is kind of why we're high on him, right? So if somebody's willing to pay closer to tier 2 prices for him because they're really high on him, yeah, sell for sure. But I'm not looking to sell just to sell. I think, what that ending was almost half the season. That was an excellent finish. So I'm definitely not trying to sell just to sell, but I'm happy to explore for him, for Brian Thomas Jr., Jason, Neighbors, all those guys that, are really young and we think of had really great finishes. Puka fits in there. If you can sell those guys for a premium, yeah, it's a good time to look.
Or if you could tier to any of these guys within this tier and get a plus. I mean, right now on Keep Trade Cut, Ladd's ranked the highest out of everybody in this tier except for London.
Yeah, and my response to questions within this tier is if you asked me to rank the guys in this tier today, and then you gave me 10 days where I didn't think about it and you asked me to do it again, because I'm old and I wouldn't remember with absolute certainty because I have no conviction in anyone in this tier. Marv is one of the scarier guys in this tier to me, and he's also one of the guys that I think a year from now could easily be in tier 1, right? Like there's nobody in this tier that is not either going to potentially produce incredibly this year, like an AJ Brown should be a top 12 to 16 wide receiver minimally, right? Feel the same way about probably London, right? Feel the same way about Rice, if and when he's healthy, should be a top 12-ish wide receiver, right? These guys are going to be producing. All of them seem to be very value insulated. I'd take any plus between any of the young guys. AJ Brown, again, I still feel differently about on a non-contending I like to get younger. I wouldn't mind moving off of AJ Brown to get younger within this tier. So that's the only one that is not always that, but any plus 2/3 and more.
I was going to ask you to define that, because anything, like I'm not taking a fourth. I don't think I would take any third, like a 2/3, maybe depending on where I'm at from who to who, but
2/26 is what I would take. 2/25 that are late, I would not take. make, but 226 thirds, because that gives me flexibility to spend those on needs over the course of the next year.
I think Wilson scares me a little bit. I love him, and I mean, I think he might be one of the, if not the most talented in this group. His situation just hasn't played out really well, so it'd be a little tough for me to take Wilson in 2/3 for Marv at this point, for example.
I do agree for that price point, except for, like I said, London and Rice. I just value higher because out of all these guys, I think that those are the two that could finish as the top 10 wide receivers. I can envision that. I mean, London, he had the second best points per game to only AJ Brown. He's only 0.2 behind AJ Brown. He was just on the edge of top 12 wide receiver numbers, points per game. And we saw it from Rice. You know, it was only 3 games and there's some concerns, but I just think that those two could be difference makers this year.
And I just want to take a moment here. JSN, I would like to apologize to you. I did you dirty. I did you wrong. Last offseason, I traded you for a random 25 first. It wound up being the 112. It was the third biggest mistake of my life so far. And I would just like to apologize for not believing in you, JSN. And hopefully I learn from this in our next tier when we're talking about somebody else on a similar arc as you.
Odunze.
Yep, exactly. That leads us to our tier 4, which has Rome Odunze.
Let's go ahead and just do it.
In the 107 through 109. Now, Justin, do you feel similarly about Odunze as you did to JSN last year, or do you feel better about Odunze?
I feel better. I think I've learned a little bit of something. I think I was a little swept up last offseason in this lack of patience and just the general concept that in Dynasty we seem to be moving on so quickly from players, which I think the general market was going that way for a little while, but I think it's swung back and adjusted the other way. I also just think when you really believe in a guy and they haven't shown you that they can't, they just necessarily haven't really fully done what we'd hope, but they have reasons, they have excuses, they have narratives, right? There's a difference between Quentin Johnson showed us he can't. Even though he had a meh year this year, we still know that he can't, right? He's never going to be him. JSN didn't show us he can't and had previously shown us he can in college, right? Rome Odunze showed us he can in college and additionally showed us in areas, in certain times, certain plays, certain stretches of games that he can. So I have learned. Thank you, JSN, for teaching me. I wish I had higher exposure to you, JSN. Everything's fine.
Yeah, I mean, Odunze's situation was really, really bad this year. We know that rookie quarterbacks, they don't produce high-end wide receiver numbers for the guys on their team, and he was probably the wide receiver 3. I mean, targets, I'm sure he was definitely number 3 because Keenan Allen, let's not forget, he was top 5 wide receiver in points per game just this season before. The dude's darn good, and DJ Moore is a good receiver as well. So there was nothing really going for him last year. I think he still flashed though, and I loved him as a prospect. He could jump up to tier 2 this year. And Ben Johnson now, I mean, I think there's so many things going in his favor now with Caleb in year 2. Keenan, we have to see, but I kind of think that he's gone. And Ben Johnson, I personally think his resume is extremely impressive. You see some OCs, they come from an elite quarterback like Adam Gase or Matt Nagy. These guys, they come from these elite quarterbacks, or they just were not the play callers because they're underneath Sean McVay, Andy Reid. But Ben Johnson led a top 5 offense 2 years in a row with a non-elite quarterback. So I think that he has a resume similar to what we saw from a guy like Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan. Not saying he's going to be that, but I think he has the upside to have that level of impact as a coach. I don't know if it's 40%, 50%, but I think he's a really good hire for that team.
As a Packers fan, I do wish he was coaching a different team next year. But look, like you said, we've seen countless times in NFL history where a great coordinator goes on to become a below average head coach. I don't expect it to happen here, but it is a possibility.
Sure.
DJ Moore is there. We like DJ Moore. He could definitely, have a new role that would be awesome in this offense potentially. I kind of think Odunze is going to lead the team in targets, though. I think not only that, I think he might get, not the exact same usage as Jamison Williams because they're not the same player, but I think you can get Odunze the ball in short space and he can do damage with it. Same with DJ Moore, obviously, but I expect Ben Johnson to be able to use both of these offensive weapons very well. Odunze, with his age, I kind of think he has that sophomore breakout. And, I think tier 2 is perfectly reasonable. I'm not going to say expectation, potential, ending for him next year.
And then exploring within this small tier. So just looking at the players here, T. Higgins, of course, incredible end to the season. Definitely rose a lot. The points per game numbers, was it 5th, JP, something like that during that down this stretch? And obviously, contract situation, one of two things happens. He re-signs in Cincinnati, in which case we know the ceiling is, wide receiver 1. The floor is a little bit lower because we've seen, a wide receiver 2 in his range of outcomes as well there. Or he goes somewhere and is the alpha, possibly a worse quarterback situation, but a lot less target competition. So we love the situation. He's a little bit older than Odunze. So let's say you're not a nuclear rebuild, not a super team. You're just kind of a team that you feel confident is going to compete the next 3 years at least. Are we taking a second to go between these two guys if it's offered on the other side, or do we feel some sort of conviction here on one versus the other at all, just to kind of challenge the tier a little bit? David first.
I'd take a 26 second on either side and take that package.
What does the second look like? Because I have a Doomsday in the tier higher when we initially did our rankings.
I think for me, I have to ask what the second looks like too. If it's a team that I think is going to end up with a bye next year, I'm questioning it. It also just depends on how old the rest of my receiving room. If I have a really old receiving room, I'd probably rather stay with the younger stud in a Dunze than go with Higgins. But if I have a lot of overall flexibility, I'd rather just keep accumulating assets if I have like a pretty balanced receiving room and probably take the second. So it's a little challenging to see Higgins here for me, just because we were any 26 first, any 25 first, and we would have happily sold him in week 5 or 6 last year, right? So he rose, and it's just a question of a year from now, right? If he's producing as wide receiver 15, 16, are we going to actually still care about him anymore? Versus what Adunze has as the ceiling. I'm just kind of questioning the upside here, although I do understand his market value, and that's why I agree with him being here.
Yeah, and T. Higgins, I think he's a great player. I just think when you look at his seasons before this year, that's why we value him that way, is because we haven't seen him do anything like this before. And Joe Burrow, he had the most production at quarterback for passing yards, passing touchdowns. So I think he is due for regression. And I think he could easily go back to wide receiver 14, 15 range next year in his range. That's probably where I'd project him around. But I know that, David, you're a little bit higher on him than I was.
Like, it's not easy to score 18 points per game. He was at 18.5 points per game. Now, you just mentioned Joe Burrow and all of his passing stats. But it's not like T. Higgins was the main recipient of those passing stats. He supported maybe the best wide receiver season any of us have seen in our lifetimes. Maybe not quite that good, but it was an incredible season. And T. Higgins at wide receiver 5 in points per game. I think it's perfectly reasonable to expect him to be down closer to 16 next year, maybe just outside wide receiver 1. But if he goes to the Patriots and he's Drake May's number 1, or maybe Bo Nix's new number 1 or something, or, is he going to lose value? I don't think so. I think he might even gain a little value before we even play another game. So,
do you think he goes into tier 3 if he goes to, say the Patriots or Broncos?
I don't think so, but I think some people would have him bump up a tier, which means you might be able to exploit that.
Patriots fans, go after them in that case.
How many leagues are you in with Patriots fans? Most of them like their players. I've noticed that, at least. It's anecdotal, don't get me wrong, but they're one of the more loyal fan bases in fantasy from what I've seen for acquiring their players.
Shout out to Jay Mamana. Hope I'm saying your name right in the listener league. I guess my thoughts a little bit on Higgins is almost, yeah, I could see him rising a second in value from where he's at right now. I don't think, just from the age standpoint. And like AJ Brown has been a wide receiver 1 multiple times. That's why he's up in tier 3. Higgins is a little bit older than most of those guys in that tier. And this is where Higgins belongs per like KTC, et cetera, right? Per market sentiment right now. I feel like the move is already baked in. People are sharper, right? Nobody is going to be surprised by the move. I still think like maybe you could get him a second more after the trade than you could trading him now. Like Higgins, talking about that trade within the tier, right? They're pretty even in value. We say we'd take a second either way right now. You might not be able to get the second, but I think after he signs, then you're able to get that second potentially. I just feel like the price has the ascension of whatever value gain he gets from a new contract kind of baked in, if that makes sense.
I mean, if you're really on top of things, sure. But if you're on top of things, you also understand there's a chance he doesn't go somewhere we like. So once you know it's somewhere we like, I do think most people's process should lead them to increases, or maybe not increase his value, but feel more confident in where we have him.
Yeah, I just don't think he's going to rise that much more. But I definitely understand when you look at the guys behind him. That's like, yeah, I would definitely take Higgins over Addison, Flowers, Devonta Smith, guys like that.
And then just continuing kind of that tier conversation, are we comfortable, or are we taking, just like in a vacuum, a tier 3 player or a tier 4 player if we have a 1-2 swap involved? So a tier 3 player and a 26 second, or a tier 4 player and a 26 first. I'll start with JP first this time.
I think I would side with the tier 3 at this moment, but I like Adunze more.
I mean, I think process says take the first, unless it's going to be a likely late first, early second kind of situation. Shoot, I think I'd take the first and pocket that first and help my team somewhere else.
Yeah, let's just look at the picks we have in the tiers. Let's take the middle pick that we have in the tier. Would you take the 103 and a 26 second, or the 108 and a 26 first?
I'd definitely do the two first in that situation.
And if we have the players in the same tier, then I think process-wise it's pretty similar, although we love the liquidity of the picks, so it's slightly different as well. So I think it's kind of difficult. I think when we go like player by player, team by team, I'm sure I could get you to take MHJ potentially and a second for T Higgins and a 26 first if if you have it to spend and you're having fun. But I think this is an interesting area, and I think this is the last of players that I actually feel like pretty comfortable and confident in being like close to cornerstone assets. I think Higgins is the one I feel not so comfortable as a cornerstone asset, but everyone on the screen right now, I kind of feel like they're the type of guys I want to build around, and everyone that comes next gets murky. Do you guys kind of agree? I'll go JP, then David again.
Yeah, no, I'm 100% with you. The tier after this one, interesting, but yeah, not cornerstone pieces that I see rising up there.
Yeah, and I'll just say, because I think he's going to get lost when we talk about this next tier, one player we struggled with putting him here or tier 4 was Chris Olave. I think once we added the picks, it became clear that maybe he doesn't belong in that tier 4, but he definitely still has the upside. And I think he has more upside than the other guys in this next tier, which would have been the main reason for that. I just wanted to mention him because I think the conversation will be better served in the next tier talking about the other guys, and it's probably a good transition. I'll just go ahead and read that tier. Got Olave, like I said, DJ Moore, George Pickens, Jordan Addison, Devonta Smith, Zay Flowers, the 110 through the 111, and a graphic mistake on my part that won't be fixed. So just a little spoiler as to what pick is in the next tier.
I second what you said about Olave. I was kind of pushing a little bit for him to be in tier 4. Justin's kind of talking like he's much more risky because of the injuries, and we went back and forth a little bit. I think he's a very talented player, but I don't love the situation. I don't really see it getting all that much better this year, so I can understand why he would fit better in this tier. But as a talent, I like him easily more than all these guys. I think Devonta Smith's good, but AJ Brown is there and they're kind of run heavy.
Yeah, on the Olave question, what eventually swayed David was he decided Olave went in tier 4. He put him in tier 4, saw 107 to 109 next to Olave, and moved Olave down. Olave's upside, I think there's only one other guy in this tier with the same upside as him, or with similarly high upside, and that is George Pickens. Those are the two guys in here who I don't know if tier 2 is possible for either of them, but I do think they both have the physical capability to be a top 5 fantasy scoring wide receiver next season. I don't know if they'll have the quarterback play to do it, but I think that they both are gifted enough as a wide receiver to do it. But Olave's injury, Pickens, well, I mean, he makes almost as bad of choices as I did with my JSN evaluation with his life. Just kidding. Nobody makes that bad of choices. But those two guys, to me, are the highest upside, higher risk guys in here.
Yeah, Pickens was definitely a point of conversation here, as well as DJ Moore. But yeah, Pickens, I personally think he belonged in the next tier. Justin said, I mean, maybe he even belongs in tier 4 based on his upside. But he had the worst points per game out of this group, and he was kind of the only show in town. That was kind of like what has me worried. I'm less of a believer than George Pickens. I understand the market and some other people. There's definitely going to be a Pickens guy in most leagues that, I understand the upside with his size, athleticism, the contested catch ability. I'm just not as interested, and I don't think the quarterback situation there's getting a whole lot better. But I can understand why you have him here. I wouldn't pay a late first for George Pickens personally.
I don't know that I would qualify my feelings on Pickens as like him so much as I understand the ability, the way he plays, the fact that there's no competition. So even if they add a guy, it might actually help him. I do think the upside argument exists for him, as Justin put it. I think he has a much lower chance of hitting it than Olave, but these other guys have some very real target competition. I like the other guys, and I would feel a lot more comfortable with him on my roster. But if we were to fast forward a year and you were to tell me Pickens is the best of this group, I wouldn't be too surprised.
And just like on that point per game kind of question, he had a beautiful stretch in the middle of the season where from week 7, so they were 4-2 week 7. This is when Russell Wilson starts out. 22.1 points per game, 11.4, 20.5, 16.9, 8.8, 16.4, then an injury. And then when he came back, he had an 8 and a 1 point per game that he put up. So when he was healthy, playing with Russ before he got that injury, we saw this guy that was putting up numbers. And I think he's a guy that can put up numbers. So yeah, like of course he didn't produce that well in the season. He played with Fields at the beginning. They didn't vibe well together. And that's like the quarterback uncertainty. If I knew Russell Wilson was going to be his quarterback next season, I would personally in my rankings easily have him in tier 4 above this, just for the one season of production that I know I would get from him with Wilson for a full year, assuming that then he is healthy. I think they bring someone in, they draft someone. I think David said he thinks that helps. I think definitely that helps him as well, having somebody else so that they can actually worry about real wide receivers and not the ghost of Mike Williams and Van Jefferson. That's enough about Pickens. The other guys in here, Zay Flowers, Devonta Smith, Jordan Addison, they're all valuable in that they're young wide receivers. Do we really see any path for ascension for these guys, or do we think that they are who we thought they are?
They are who we thought they were. I don't know that any of them are going to go up higher in tiers. DJ Moore's a little older, but I don't think he's going to go up in this tier either. I also don't know that I have a strong preference if I'm competing, maybe DJ Moore, but I kind of think Addison's probably my highest ranked player behind Olave in this tier, but it's close.
Yeah, I think if there was one to ascend of these last three, I think it would be Devonta Smith if somehow AJ Brown was out of town, because I think Devonta Smith's a really good receiver. He's wide receiver 17 this year, despite them being very run heavy, and also AJ Brown's presence. So for him to be almost a top 15 wide receiver still, that's impressive. So I think if he got more targets, that maybe he could rise up a bit. But he's starting to get not old yet, but he's starting to approach that range. But he would be the one guy. I mean, Addison, it's tough because he's going to be with Hawkinson and Justin Jefferson for the near future.
Maybe the most interesting conversation we can have here is, what are we doing? Are we actually paying the 110 or 111 for these guys? Are we trying to add something to move up? Are we trying to tear down into veteran producers and pick up an asset? Are we happy with staying with them? Because to me, I don't really like this tier. I would like to move in either direction.
I don't really like this tier very much either. I'm happy to pay this for Pickens because I think he has a lot of upside. I'm not paying this for Addison. I would pay it in a vacuum for Smith, Flowers. I would not pay it for Moore, and I don't think I'd pay it for Olave because he scares me too much. I gave Awesome Dumpling, friend of the show, when he was asking me what to try to do with the 112, I said I would love to try to buy DJ Moore. For me, that's just the price I'm comfortable paying for him. That's probably the price I'm comfortable paying for Olave and Addison myself. But I do think it's a fair price for these guys because if you're playing in a start 11, even a start 10 potentially, you need to fill out spots. And these are guys that you are ecstatic to have as your first flex. If you have them as a wide receiver 3, you're not upset either. But these are guys like if you're needing to fill out a roster of 11 players and you can turn a 110, 111 into one of these types of guys, I think it's a good move to make. I just don't want to turn a 26 first into one of these guys because of the potential of it being early.
I haven't talked about DJ Moore yet, but he was someone that David and I were discussing a lot, and I'm pretty high on DJ Moore. The market's not all that high yet, but I think similar to like what I said about Ramadunze, if this offense does take a big step forward, I mean, DJ Moore this season with kind of a pretty bad situation like I outlined for Ramadunze as well, he still was wide receiver 29 points per game, which wasn't too bad for that situation, but I think it's going to be a lot better. And if he is playing that slot role, I think he's been misused oftentimes, and I think when he's working short and underneath, he's very dynamic with the ball in his hands. If he's playing sort of the Amon-Ra role, not saying he's going to score wide receiver 3 numbers, but I think he could be a top 12 wide receiver potentially. I'm not projecting that, but I think that's in his range of outcomes, and I mean, he was a top 10 wide receiver just last year, actually.
Wide receiver 6, if I'm not incorrect.
Sounds right.
It's within his range of outcomes. You are not wrong. I'm happy to. I probably would consider paying the 111, 110 for DJ Moore. I just wouldn't do it in every situation where I think I'd be pretty confident doing it in a vacuum. Just almost, I'd say, yeah, Pickens, Smith, Flowers, 9 times out of 10, I would do it. More, it's probably more of 50-50.
I guess for me, my main point there was, are these guys giving you anything that, Evans or Godwin or, Worthy, or I guess Worthy kind of is younger, so it depends on him, but like Terry McLaurin hasn't come up yet. Several veterans that I think you can get a plus on top of and not hurt your lineup. We just said none of these guys have much upward mobility. I don't know. I feel like you're fine staying here. It's not like you have to get out of these assets. I just would rather live in different tiers.
I hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree with the principle of it, but just knowing that Zay Flowers, I feel like he's a good wide receiver. I think he's somewhere between wide receiver 19 and 28. You need those types of players on your roster, and I feel like I believe he's an NFL talent. I believe he's going to be somewhere between wide receiver 19 to 28 for 3 more years because they'll probably give him his first year. He's a first rounder, has his first round option, so 3 more years under contract. Smith is under contract, so those two guys especially. It's just knowing that you have that guy to fill that specific spot in your roster for 3 years, and I think they are who they thought they are, is actually not a bad thing. And I think like a Mike Evans or a Terry McLaurin or that type of guy, I could throw a second and 2/3 and probably try to get them in the offseason. And I might prefer Zay Flowers and Mike Evans like to the 111, a second and 2/3. I definitely prefer I'd prefer to try to get at those other guys in a different way than tearing down off of those two, if that makes sense, in a start 11. But in a start 9, I would absolutely want to do exactly what you're saying, which is tear down to Terry McLaurin or tear down to Mike Evans and a 26 second for one of these guys that's worth the first, if that's even in the range of outcomes as possible, which market wise, it might not be until we get further into the non-point scoring season and those ages scare us more.
Yeah, but how do you get those extra seconds and thirds to make that deal? It's by trading down to the lowest common denominator on some of these flex spots. You know what I mean? Say if I have the assets, maybe I don't care as much about tearing down, but if I need some flexibility in my lineup, I just think this is a great spot to do it.
I get a new second and third every year, David. What are you talking about?
And David, I do know exactly what you're saying there, and you're not wrong. It's just the question of these guys, I think, are in some ways underappreciated and undervalued. I know that they are somewhat replaceable, but the fact that they are the high end of replaceable for multiple years, I think is more valuable than I think the market sentiment and maybe the 110, 111 is measuring it. It's just kind of how I feel. I don't know if I'm right.
Well, if you were always right, then we wouldn't need me or JP on the podcast. So
I've never been wrong before. Don't go back to the JSN bit. All right, moving on to tier 6 here. We have, we talked about some of these guys. Terry McLaurin, Tyreek Hill, Brandon Ayuk, Xavier Worthy, Jaden Reed, Chris Godwin, and Jalen Waddle, baby Waddle, baby Waddle, baby Waddle, as well as the 112, which David spoiled earlier.
Sorry.
How could you?
So this is the first tier that I feel like has a incredibly drastic split right down the middle of don't even mess with it if you're not competing.
Yeah, what you're talking about, Tyreek Hill, Terry McLaurin, Chris Godwin.
Maybe Ayuk.
Godwin's a little bit older than you would expect. He is turning 29 within the next month or two. So he's not young anymore, unfortunately. But I mean, he was wide receiver 2 in points per game. It was a 7-game sample size. Liam Cohen is now gone. That's the best we've ever seen for Godwin. No one's projecting him to do that again. But I mean, maybe he could be a top 15, top 20 wide receiver. I might think is pretty reasonable because Baker Mayfield, they have that connection now. The offense has been great. Hopefully it doesn't take too much of a step back with the OC change. Him and Tyreek probably have the highest ceiling in this tier. Do you guys agree with that?
I mean, I think McLaurin has shown that he has a pretty good ceiling. Maybe not quite as high as those two, but, is Tyreek ever going to hit his ceiling? And if I thought he was, I'd probably have him in like tier 4.
Yeah, he turns 31 in about a month.
Yeah, I wouldn't be shocked if Terry McLaurin finishes highest in this group. I wouldn't be shocked if he doesn't either, but he showed his best season of his career last year with a rookie quarterback who we saw improve down the stretch, who now has a full offseason of building chemistry with him. And I don't think Terry McLaurin is going to suffer incredibly from adding another wide receiver to this offense, at least in year 1. I think it could be like what we were talking about with like Pickens earlier, where he could actually benefit from having somebody else to take a little bit of attention away from him because he does not need much to get open. And if you put someone else to actually really worry about in the offense, I think he could take advantage of it a little bit. Out of these old guys here, let's just take them on a competing bucket. I'm going to take Brandon Ayuk out of that conversation, David, because I don't think he's a competing target for this year with the same level of confidence because of the injury, although not opposed to buying him. So looking at Godwin, Tyreek Hill, and Terry McLaurin, if I give you a 2/3 either way, is that enough to get you to switch between any of these guys, gentlemen?
Yeah, I think so at this point, between those 3.
That makes me hate my Tyreek Hill exposure. I won some chips, though. I won some chips.
That's all that counts, man.
JP, do you agree with that kind of 2/3 price point between these guys that you'd be willing to go anyway, or do you have some conviction in another way?
I do feel that way. I agree.
Single third then between these guys, is that enough? A single 26 third, David, or are we now starting to get to conviction zone?
I think I could get more to to move off of one of these guys to another piece, I'd probably just stay no matter who I had. I don't know. Even if it's fine to pick up a third, I just feel like you're trading to trade there, and I don't really approve of that for my own process personally.
Yeah, I think the only real justification for that is if you're getting a stack and just the benefit that adding Terry McLaurin then to, or Tyreek Hill or Chris Godwin, because of the stack it gives you and how that can help you win a championship just from the variance that that can give you on a week-to-week basis. JP, would you take a third between these guys, or is that kind of where it's like maybe not necessarily?
Yeah, no, I don't really see. I personally have them all in the exact same tier, so nah.
And then just when I'm looking at this, tell me, am I crazy for thinking that Xavier Worthy should be at the top of this tier and that we should almost be considering Xavier Worthy in tier 5 based on what we saw down the stretch and so far in the playoffs? I mean, against Houston, he was the only wide receiver who had a reception. Like, that's crazy. Like, this guy he's showing things. He's a focal point in the offense now, and next year he's going to be going into year 2.
You're a little MIA during the week. I was shocked that you didn't bring him up though. Tier 5. I was like, I expect to have a conversation on Worthy in this tier, and it just never happened, which is fine. I think Rice definitely takes away a lot of the work. Some of that volume goes down a bit. I think he's a fine player to add. I think, especially at this price, I'd be happy to do it. I think if I have a younger team, he's definitely the top of this tier. But if I'm competing, I wouldn't be against pivoting off of Worthy for a proven stud.
Yeah, I've pretty much had similar feelings about Worthy for a while now, which he had 11 points per game. I know you said at the end of the year, he definitely looked better. At the beginning of the year, it was pretty rough, but points per game weren't amazing. I think it was the last 3 games of the year is when he kind of started to ascend a little bit. I just think that Rashee Rice is taking that role. I saw that Matt Harmony posted recently his ADOT, and Worthy's ADOT was super, super low. And that's the line's very similarly to a guy like Rashee Rice and Travis Kelce. So I think that I don't know if he's ever going to be a guy that ascends a ton, in my opinion, but I could be wrong, and I understand why you would be interested in putting him at the top of this tier.
And then Waddle. I think we saw a little bit more from him near the end of the season, but he, outside of a 3-game stretch where he was 28.4, 11.3, and 20.9 from weeks 12 to 14, he only surpassed 10 PPR points in week 1 outside of that. How do you really justify, besides the fact that we've seen him be a wide receiver 1 before Tyreek, we hope Tyreek leaves, like, paint me the picture on why I want Waddle right now.
Well, I guess I would be the one to do that. Me and David had conversations about this. He was a little lower. I was a little higher on Waddle. The market reflects that he's above guys like Pickens, Terry McLaurin, DJ Moore even. And it's because of what we saw from him in the first 2 years. In his rookie season, he came off a torn ACL, and from weeks 9 on, he was a wide receiver 1. As a sophomore, he's a wide receiver 1, but when Tyreek comes in, he's the guy. And last year, it was a little bit down. It wasn't that bad. His points per game were still fine. But this year, the whole offense was just messy. I don't know what happened because last year they were a top 3 scoring offense. We see that regression happen sometimes, and that's what we really, really saw this year, and it was in a big, big way. Of course, Tua got hurt, and I think there's that narrative right now that, Tyreek Hill, he said he wants out of town, and even if he doesn't, then let's say he has 1 more year, and if he does take over, I think that he still has good upside because we've seen him put up top 12 numbers before. Like you said, David, probably not projecting that he's going to do that, but I could see him putting up high-end wide receiver 2 numbers if Tyreek Hill is gone. I think he's due for some positive regression as well as this offense in general. He's 26 years old. We've seen him be a PPR machine as a rookie, and then in this second year, he was incredibly efficient. So I don't think he's like an all-world talent or anything, but I think he's a very good player still and could be a decent wide receiver 1. And if it's on a good offense, I think that's going to be pretty valuable.
I had him in tier 7. The market argument was definitely what allowed me to come around on putting him in tier 6. I like to listen to the market because if I don't like a player, but the market does, then I can sell him for more than I think he's worth, and that makes me happy. So I get it. But I'm also a believer in a player shows us who he is, especially through 4 seasons in the NFL where he's played most every game in every season.
Most of every game, though, he does go out injured every game for at least 10 plays.
Might get banged up a little bit, but it's the NFL. Everyone gets banged up.
No, he manages to get back on the field. You can't hate him for it.
It's better than T. Higgins, right?
It sure is.
Nickname him Blue Tent. You see it every other week on Sleeper.
I think with him, though, he did have a wide receiver 1 finish technically, but it was still under 16 points per game. And that's typically the threshold that I look for an actual wide receiver 1 finish. He's never eclipsed that. I mean, he has had 2 15-point per game. So, I'll throw that out there. And Not trying to pull anything over anyone's eyes there. But look, he's a wide receiver 2 guy. He's going to be 27 during the season next year. His game's built on speed, so I would expect it to fall off a little quicker. Even if Hill leaves after next year, that's going to be Waddle going into his age 28 season. It's hard for me to get excited about that. And I guess the other thing I'll say is between tier 6 and tier 7, you could have just put some names in a hat. There's only a few that I have really strong conviction on. I get it. And if you like Waddle and you like him above most of these guys, it's fine. I'm not going to say you're wrong. He doesn't excite me nearly as much as he did a couple years ago. I'll put it that way.
The last man in this tier, Jaden Reed. I think I'm ready to move down to tier 7 already. My hot take from our hot takes episode was we would not see a wide receiver in the top 18 in points per game. My hotter take was that we would not see a wide receiver in the top 24 in points per game. And where did Jaden Reed finish up, guys? Do you know?
Do you mean a Packers receiver? Because we'll see at least
What did I
24
say?
receivers in the top 24.
What did I say?
You just didn't specify. You just said we wouldn't see a receiver in the top 24.
Packers receiver in the top. Yeah, my hot take was that we would not see a Packers receiver in the top 24, and he finished 29th as their wide receiver 1. I know we just saw Watson go down with an injury, but Watson was never taking the types of targets that Reed's competing for, you know? So, like, they're taking the deep threat guy out of there, I don't think really opens things up more for Reed in particular, you know? And if anything, it puts other guys on the field who I think are more diverse route tree guys than Watson was, which maybe threatens his route tree even more potentially. I don't have any basis for that. I'm just talking. But what is his actual ceiling? Kind of sell me on why we even care at this point.
You want me to go first because I'm the Packer fan? I know we're both higher on him, JP. But look, upside is, in at least small spurts, we have seen him be elite. I initially had him in tier 7 because I think a lot of it is, as a Packers fan, I get really frustrated because you see when he's used properly the impact he can have on a game, and it's elite. I think he has the most upside in this tier outside of Worthy, just because Worthy's a couple years younger. But I think Reed's the better NFL wide receiver. I don't know what it is. Why LaFleur you can see multiple games in a row where it doesn't even seem like he's part of the game plan. Like, this guy's your best wide receiver, arguably the second best player in your offense. I mean, outside of a couple offensive linemen, I guess, but we don't care about them. This is fantasy talk. So the case for him is upside.
I mean, I think he's a really good route runner. Just pulling up what he did as a rookie on reception perception, he was above 70th percentile against man, zone, and press. That's extremely impressive. We know what he can do as a yak guy as well. They even give him carries, end arounds, and all that as well. It's just that they don't, like just David said, it's the usage is weird. And I think you even see his snap counts sometimes are a little bit low. And I think Watson being out will help him get on the field more. Maybe it'll put more thought into how Matt LaFleur is going to use Jaden Reed in the offseason with Christian Watson being gone. Maybe he wants to get explosive plays by getting him, screen passes or slants more often because Christian Watson was a big play guy. You can get big plays without it being a target down the field as well. So I think that there is a chance that he does rise up to be a top 24 wide receiver in points per game. He's still young, and there's going to be a lot of questions about contracts with Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson, Dante Wicks. All those are coming up within the next couple of years as well. So I think he's a great player. I think you're right that his upside is a little bit capped, though.
Your argument, you said there's a chance he rises up to be a top 24 wide receiver in points per game. If we went down to our tiers 8, 9, and 10, which we don't have built, you could say the same thing about almost any wide receiver within a certain range, though. I think he's just a guy in a range.
I think it's a strong chance. I don't think it's like, maybe he can get there. I think it's a strong chance that he would be there. I mean, you said he's wide receiver 29 this year. Wasn't that far off.
I think he has a much higher chance than the next tiers of guys. One thing that I'm interested in, there wasn't a lot of under center. There wasn't a lot of under center play action. And I kind of think maybe it's because of Love and how banged up he actually was. And that's where a lot of Reed's big plays came from. Under center play action. He had, deep seam ball or deep crossing route, deep in route, those kinds of things. I think that's where a lot of his big plays came from, and that just, for whatever reason, wasn't a huge part of the offense towards the end of the year. I don't know if maybe it's a Jacobs thing, but I think more likely it was Love and his knee. So hopefully he gets healthy and that comes back.
As a Lions fan, I wish them nothing but success when they're playing the Bears. Moving on to tier 7 here. We only have a few guys, Mike Evan, DK Metcalf, and Jameson Williams, as well as an early second. I kind of was a little AFK. I've been buying a car this week. I think I'd push for, if we have Waddle and Reed, I prefer Metcalf to those two guys, I think, because, hey, he can actually be a wide receiver too. We've seen it more consistently from him. Although this past year we did see him at wide receiver 32 behind Reed. I at least have him kind of in that same tier. Kind of curious Tell me why I'm wrong, guys, because I kind of missed part of that conversation in the sleeper chat.
Look, I'll be honest. I kind of had him, Waddle, Reed, Jameson Williams kind of all grouped together. And, through discussion, we kind of sorted it this way. So I don't think you're wrong necessarily. My big case against DK is similar to what I was saying with Waddle. His game is built on freakish strength and athleticism. The strength, maybe not so much for Waddle, but for DK, definitely. And he's going to be 28, I believe. Yeah, I think he's going to turn 28 in the season next year or shortly after, maybe.
But it's just last year he turned 27.
But that's how age works magically. Look, I'm also a big believer in JSN. I think JSN's the alpha there now. I think DK is going to fall off a cliff here soon. It might not be all the way off the cliff to where he's unusable, but I don't think he has wide receiver one in his range of outcomes anymore. I think he is what he is, kind of like I was saying about Waddle, and I'm not excited to pay a first for them.
Yeah, I think it's probably not something I could see him being a wide receiver one again. I mean, he has done it. I think that if he were to do it, it probably would have to be like a 12 touchdown type of season, which, maybe he can do. And the touchdowns were a little bit lower this year, which kind of hurt him. And the offensive line, like, oh my gosh, I can't with their O line. Brought in a new coordinator with Clint Kubiak. I think that he does a really good job of tying the pass game and run game together. We've seen that with the Kubiak system, and I think that could help with some play action. I don't really like the way Ryan Grubb did it, and on a whole season basis, it felt very collegey the more we went along, and I think that could help maybe get some more big plays for him, but I do think that JSN is the number one target for sure moving forward. But I think DK could be a guy who's like a mid wide receiver 2, back end wide receiver 2 for a few more years, and he's getting a little up there in age, but I think he probably belongs in tier 6 personally.
I can't separate him from Reed, Waddle personally. Even Godwin, I'd rather have Metcalf than Godwin if it's the best I could do pivot wise and I'm not competing. I'd much rather, if I'm not knowing I'm 100% competing, I'd prefer him to Hill. I'd prefer him to McLaurin in a vacuum if I couldn't go other directions, although I think those guys are probably potentially more valuable on the open market.
Well, maybe next week don't buy a car and you can participate in the tiering.
That's fair. That's fair. Good news. I won't need to buy another car for 2 years at least. So, all right, looking at Mike Evans here. Again, tough to really differentiate him from the guys above him. The argument's probably just age at this point. Is that kind of where we're coming from here, guys?
Voter fatigue, kind of like how you can't get these same MVPs. Some years, like Jokic might not win it this year, which is silly. Lamar might not win it this year. Allen has a good case, but anyways, I kind of think that's happened with Evans. Everyone's like, oh, he's 1,000 yards, 10 touchdowns, whatever. 1,000 yards, 10 touchdowns, who cares? Well, they're pretty darn good, as it turns out. So I don't know. I think I prefer McLaurin and Godwin and I guess Tyreek, but it's close. Like I said, you could just lump tier 6 and 7 together, and I don't think anyone would argue too much.
Evans is the oldest in the group from tier 6 and tier 7. So I think that does just slightly push him down. And Liam Cohen being gone, I think that he probably is going to regress a little bit, which Mike Evans, it took him to the very, very last play of the game to get to 1,000 yards. And I was shocked. I was like, wait, what? I thought he's been great all year.
Classy move, Buccaneers.
Oh, that was awesome. That was one of the best moments I've seen.
I can't believe they just let him have it, too. If I was... It was the Saints, right, that they were playing. If I was them, I would have put all 11 guys on it. Like, no, you're not getting this.
Yeah, and I want to put out this study, but we look at teams that have really, really high touchdown totals on the season, and they almost all regress in some way, sometimes in a big way, after they are a top 3 scoring offense. I mean, the Buccaneers scored a ton of touchdowns. Evans was a beneficiary of that. I think the touchdowns probably will come down, although we know he's capable of doing that. But going into his age 32 season, it does get a little bit sketchy for me there.
I hear you. I just think he is what he is until he retires. Maybe he'll drop off, but he's not a guy that burns people or separates, right? He's a savvy route runner. He's an incredible contested catch guy. He just knows how to get open in the end zone, and he has a mind meld with Baker Mayfield. So I would bet on him being, with the exception of if Godwin is healthy and he returns, I think Godwin probably I think might perform above him, but out of tier 6 and 7, I'd give him a 15 to 20% chance of being the highest points per game guy out of these 2 tiers.
So you feel better about him than Tyreek?
I think they're about even. I think it's close to a coin flip, to be honest with you.
Even if that is the case, I think Tyreek's upside is higher. He's just a little bit younger.
His elite ceiling, yes, but the floor, I think for Evans, I feel more comfortable than I do for Hill.
I can't say it for a guy going in his age 32 season. I mean, I agree that he's not a guy who wins purely on athleticism, but I think you still have to get over the top of a DB still, which we don't know when that age cliff comes. It's different for everybody, but sometimes it is 31, 32.
Never came for Evans before, so how could it just come now?
It comes out of
That's
nowhere,
the thing
man.
about the age cliff. You only fall down at once.
Bryant, Like some of these guys that hit them like a brick wall, and that's just there's just some risk there.
I don't think I quite have the conviction you have that with Evans. I mean, there's 10 guys. You just said 15 to 20%. That means he's probably your odds-on favorite to lead in fantasy points of this group, but I just don't see that. I'm happy to have him where I have him, and if someone wants to offer me a late first, or if I can add to him to get a future first, I'm happy to do so. But also happy to just have him and let him ride off that cliff. Sometimes that's the best thing to do with older guys. Always like to get value out of them, but you never know, that early second could be a complete swing and a miss, and now you don't even have a year or two left of production. So,
and last guy in our tier here, Jameson Williams. At the price point of an early second, I'm probably out, guys. Do either of you guys have any exposure to Jameson Williams?
No.
Nope.
And thank you for joining us for another episode. I'm just kidding. Should we, I guess is the question, guys. Should we have any exposure to him?
I mean, he's wide receiver 21 on Keep Trade Cut.
Yeah, at that price point, no, honestly. If he falls back to where he was in the 30s, like maybe we should get some exposure, but just not a big believer in the talent overall. And like I said about the offense regressing and Ben Johnson leaving, it does scare me, especially at wide receiver 21. I mean, that's rich.
I mean, counterpoint, I've never been a guy to be a Jameson Williams truther.
Oh my.
But from a total point standpoint, he is wide receiver 22. Part of that is because he was healthy. From a points per game standpoint, 26, tied with Cortland Sutton. Not too much lower. He's young. He has been improving from a football standpoint. Slow start, knucklehead. There is there's a picture to be painted, and people that like him liked him when he was doing the dumbest stuff and getting suspended for every single thing. So there is some staying value there. I don't know, guys. David, tell me what to think.
The value insulation is nice, but it's only nice if you drafted him and missed, and now you can sell him to get out on it. I'm not trying to buy into it. It turns out he's wide receiver 29 on DLF startup ADP early in the startup season, so I don't know how strong that signal is, but he is, back end wide receiver 2, high end wide receiver 3 in value most places. So we thought we should keep him in here. In best ball, I'm happy to pay an early second because you never know when those big weeks are going to come, but they really help. In lineup leagues, if it's deeper, I might do that. I definitely am nervous about him. And as we started out talking about him, I don't have any shares. So, I don't love him. I'm higher on him than I was a year ago. I think that's probably the best thing I can say about him.
And they score 70 touchdowns in a season, most since 2018. That definitely helps.
It sure does. Miss you, Ben Johnson.
He can't throw very well, though, right? Through that interception.
He just also had other bonehead plays that lost or almost lost games for them, penalties out of bounds and dumb stuff. And I just don't like him as a Lions fan, but everything's fine. And thank you for joining us for another episode of the Dynasty Construction Podcast. We hope you found this as useful for you as it was for us. Please remember to like and subscribe wherever you listen or view. And from all of us here at the Dynasty Construction Podcast, until next time.